Member of Spruce Grove-St. Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the midst of an emergency, the scale of which we saw in Fort McMurray, it is of the utmost importance to remember the many communities nearby that can also be affected. To the Minister of Indigenous Relations, what has the government done to ensure the needs of First Nations and Métis communities in Alberta are considered and addressed in an emergency such as this?
Minister of Indigenous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. My ministry does have a seat at the Provincial Operations Centre, which works with ministries and federal partners to coordinate the initial response in any kind of disaster, and this ensures that my ministry is closely involved in the wildfire response and relaying information as needed to coordinate. There's a dedicated unit coordinating First Nations and Métis communities' needs, which is comprised of 4 field officers and 1 manager. These officers work closely with Indigenous communities, providing supports to ensure all evacuees are.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. First supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the update. I'm glad to hear there is a system in place to help coordinate this response, and the generosity of all Albertans has been moving to see, and in particular, many First Nations and Métis communities that I've talked to have opened their homes and hearts to evacuees in need. Again, to the Minister, many of these communities are remote and limited in terms of resources. What is the ministry doing to ensure that they have the supplies they need?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I, too, was very touched by the generosity and professionalism of the First Nations and Métis communities who opened their homes to the evacuees in need and continue to be an important part of the firefighting and of the safety provided to members from Fort McMurray. The First Nations field officers are in constant contact with the community and working together with them. Over the weekend, we were able to ensure that there were shipments arranged to bring food, baby supplies, and other necessities to Fort Mackay and to Fort Chip, and we continue to monitor the situation. I would like to thank the First Nations for their
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Second supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It sounds like the field officers and Provincial Operations Centre are working effectively with Indigenous communities. Again, to the Minister, can you tell me what you have done personally to assist in this emergency?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Our government is working very closely with the Indigenous communities, and I and the Premier have both been deeply involved in this over the last week. You may know that the Premier is in Fort McMurray today with the Grand Chief Coudray of Treaty 8, looking over the situation and working towards solutions for the future. I, of course, have personally been involved with the Grand Chief myself, as well as the Grand Chief of Treaty 8, the President of the Métis National Association, the Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs of 4, 5, 6, I'm just counting as I look down.
Thank you.